Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath. I'm really excited to talk to my guest today, Samantha Kenny. She is the Senior Program Officer with the World Wildlife Fund's Global Food Waste Team. She focuses on strategies for hospitality and food service businesses to address food waste. Hi, Samantha.
Hi, Tracy. Good to be here.
What does the World Wildlife Fund have to do with food waste?
Yeah, absolutely. And food is on all of our minds. I know I am hungry in preparation of the meal we're going to be having soon. So I hope everyone's enjoying. So the World Wildlife Fund has been working on the topic of food for the last several years. You might be familiar with WWF's work on wildlife or ocean conservation or climate. But actually, a few years ago, WWF started their goal team, which is focused on food. And that came up once WWF started to understand the really outsized impact that food production and consumption have on the fragile ecosystems and the communities where we do our work. So we started assessing how WWF is well positioned to work on food, how we can bring in our network of organizations and experts to move towards a food system that better serves people and nature. So WWF now has work focusing on food production systems all the way at the beginning of the supply chain.
Wow.
We also work on food consumption and sustainable diets, which means different things for communities all around the world. And I focus in on food loss and waste, which is really finding ways all along the food system to maximize the amount of food available for people to eat. And then if we're unable to eat all of the food that we've then finding ways to maximize the value of food by making sure it's not ending up in landfills through partnerships with farmers and these types of strategies to get the most value out of these items that we spend so much time and resources and love to grow and share.
And everything that when you say food waste, everything that's such a negative connotation. And the way you just said it makes it such a positive way to look at it, right? The value of food, right? And the value that these people who are growing it around the world and transporting it, harvesting it, transporting it, serving it, it really elevates what food is, because it's something that, and I always use this quote, food is our common ground. It's, we all have to eat.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, when we speak about food systems, sometimes it can feel a little bit sterile. Sometimes we're in really formal conversations if we're meetings and events professionals about, specific banquet event orders. And these really, at the end of the day, we are wasting 1/3 to 40% of the food that we grow. And we have this sterile relationship with it and these statistics that can bring us away from what food really is. We all eat 3 times a day. We prepare food for our families and we sit around the table and dine with our friends. And this is something that's very personal to each individual. So it's not, these solutions are not ways of changing how we eat or what we eat or all of these things. It's actually getting us more closely connected with our food systems, more closely connected with our communities, and finding more sustainable ways to all live together and eat delicious food. So when you hear that 1/3 or 40% of food goes to waste or doesn't feed the people it was intended to, that can seem like a really big problem, which it is, a big waste. But it's actually also a really huge opportunity, because when we think about feeding ourselves and feeding our communities, we're often thinking there's not enough food. But in fact, there is enough food, even right around the corner. It's just about distributing it in an equitable way and finding ways to connect your community to make sure that you're making the most of the food available. But we definitely have enough. Let's just share it a little better.
When you use that stat, and I use it all the time, is that 40%, we do have enough food. If we're throwing 40% of the food away. And the statistic that I like to use in this meetings and events world industry is that, and this is based on the 2018 Events Industry Council study, is that meeting planners in the US alone spend $64 billion on food and beverage.
Wow.
60, and that's directly and indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
And indirectly is like those offshoot dinners that you have when you're traveling and things like that. But if we waste 40% of that, I mean, let's just do 40% of 50,000 of 60,000 is $24 billion.
Wow.
I mean, what could you do with $24 billion? And even if your budget is $100,000 for your food and for your specific event, and 40% of that gets wasted, that's $40,000 that went down the tube.
Yeah.
Right. Or went somewhere. So because you're focused on from harvesting, from farming, all the way to us in the convention centers and the hotels, who is responsible for curbing food waste?
Totally. So I am really lucky at this moment where I get to collaborate with my colleagues in WWF. I'm speaking about food systems, right? We take the 20,000 foot view. But when I started in this role, I've been in this role for about 6 years. And when I started, I was actually a subject matter expert on addressing food waste in hospitality and food service businesses. And that's still where my subject matter expertise lies. Though, of course, we love to be connected to the other aspects of the supply chain so we can make the most impact as we're developing our projects and programs. So I would say 6 years ago, I started my job by putting on gloves and going into a hotel kitchen and measuring food waste on a bin and collecting that primary data. And that same year, I spent time at meetings and events and convention centers across the United States to really see what these key drivers of food waste really were. And I'd had some experience in the food service sector before, but it was so humbling and enlightening to have conversations with leaders across, all of these leader stakeholders within the event space, because each individual really has a role to play in curbing food waste and raising the value of food in the context of meetings and events. And I actually feel that, I wrote some notes on what I wanted to make sure to touch on during this time. And the biggest change you can make in your meetings and events planning cycle is really increasing transparent communication. It's all about communicating more clearly to different stakeholders that you're collaborating with. Because you say, as a meeting planner, a third-party meeting planner, you can't control every aspect of food production and each, a chicken breast that ends up on the buffet or something like this. And also the executive chef can't control what the conversations that happen in the event sales rooms, and servers can't control what happens when guests are taking their plates and things like this. So it's really all about building these increased transparent communication points for all of the stakeholders in meetings and events, and also giving each individual a little bit of a benefit of the doubt that they can see some of the nuance that we're juggling. We don't want to run out of food at a meeting or event. We don't want anyone to go hungry or feel that they're not satisfied by the food and beverage offerings. But we also know that the venue, the caterer, the client, and many individuals have personal values that are looking towards community support or environmental sustainability, or even just grew up with a clean plate club in their house where they just couldn't leave things left over. So really, I think right now, it's considered the industry standard and not really noted that there's a waste of food during these events. But what I found in my interviews and conversations is actually everyone at a meeting and event is dialed in to food waste and the food offerings. And they're wondering what's happening to that food up on the buffet. Where is it going next? When can they eat? How long can they eat and how much? And we can really leverage these interest points by each of these folks at a meeting or event. And we can create spaces for more honest conversations about food and how we should be serving it and how we should be eating it.
Can you give me an example, like a specific example of how a meeting planner could transparently communicate what they're doing? What does that mean? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think there's a big fear about doing something like putting a sign on a buffet that says, don't take too much. We're trying to save money, save blah, blah, blah. That's something that gets everyone really nervous. And it's also really not at the heart of what we're looking to do through a program like this. Our ultimate goal is reducing food waste for the benefit of the business, the moment that food is being served. The most sustainable thing you can do if you're looking at a plate of food is eat it or have it eaten where it is instead of moving it around or doing these things. And I feel that there are a lot of opportunities to have really positive conversations around food and the value of food and not leaving a massive amount of leftovers unclaimed at the end of a meeting and event. And I think the easiest place to start is through really positively framed communications before an event. So you don't have to wait until guests show up to share your value of food with them. It can be as simple as adding it onto an RSVP page, maybe asking something about dietary preferences. Often you're asking already about allergies. And I think it's very critical to have allergies and food safety information very clearly labeled and at the top. But I know, Trey, I'm right on the same page with you. But after that, I believe there's an opportunity as folks are thinking about their food requirements and then food preferences. Are you planning to join us for lunch, or will you be dining out? And you can actually add 1 or 2 additional questions on your RSVP list to get much closer to the actual number of folks that will be arriving and dining with you. I think this is extra critical at multi-day events or events that cross multiple meals, because we'll see one audit we did saw 1/3 of the food waste that was produced was just because of no-shows. And I think the no-show condition is one that many meetings and events planners are really aware of. And there might be these moments, even just in RSVPs, or even just sharing, we're seeking to reduce food waste during this event. Share XYZ with us so we can better serve you and make sure you're full and happy for the entirety of the event, and those types of things. So don't wait until people show up. And when they do show up, speak about it confidently. Share what items you've chosen, why. We saw from our survey that folks here love vegetarian options. Take a look at our menu. We sourced these locally. The second that a guest or an individual has that additional understanding of the value of the food they're eating, they're much less likely to pile up their plate and just leave it for a server to pick up, because they're envisioning the people all along the chain that got it to them. So just sharing those value-added pieces, even without mentioning waste or sustainability, can really increase the value that your guests will place on the food that they're offered. So.
And I propose when I do my speaking and teaching on this as well, is that if your food and beverage events are not mandatory attendance, then you definitely need to ask the question, right? Will you be attending? And I like adding that statement in, hey, to make sure that we have enough food for everyone and to avoid food waste, ordering too much food, can you please let us know what your plans are for this event, for these different food functions, right? And that's a good way to kind of embed that message without, saying, we want to know whether you're going to be here. And yes, your plan might change day of, right? But that's one person and that's not going to hinder it. But why plan? And it's really also getting a hold of if you can track your arrival and departure schedules from your hotels, right? That's another way to look at that as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'll also say, if you have an updated understanding of headcount at the event, it's not too late to save the food that would be prepared for those no-shows. It's critical that you speak to your contact on property. If you, at registration, you realize, a bus didn't show up or, something happened, share that with even just your contact on site. They can contact the culinary team. And even if they've already prepared all of the food, they can hold that excess food at quality, at temperature, in the back of house, and find ways to reuse it and make sure it doesn't end up in the trash. So keep that open communication as much as you can, because there's always something that can be done.
And I think that open communication actually has to start at that RFP and that site visit, because you can't wait till you're on site. And an event that I did in April, we had a bunch of diced beets, and yes, they were kept in the back, because nobody ate what I wanted them to eat, but we could have used that in a salad the next day, or that could have been donated, right? Thinking about that, but you have to get that process in place up front, so the chefs and their teams don't just trash it.
Completely. And so you bring up a really critical point in the meetings and events process where food waste can be avoided. And that is in the event sales discussions, when you're sitting down with a client, with a venue, with a caterer, and actually speaking about how the food service will look day of. That's the moment where you can share your own preferences and priorities around sustainability, whether it's community support, environmental sustainability. Food waste fits into many of these areas, and interventions to reduce or recover surplus food can definitely support environmental outcomes and absolutely support community outcomes too. So you can come to those discussions and say, it is our standard to work with our venues and caterers to have a plan B for surplus food. We are knowledgeable that there is a food donation partner down the road. The hope is that, and if I'm doing my job well enough, and all of the ecosystem of food waste folks are as well, that we're going to be seeing venues and caterers much more and more have existing relationships with food donation partners and food waste diversion partners, and have that as part of their offering. But in some cases, if you want to go and have the full picture, there are ways that you can contact local stakeholders, and really just a quick Google search in many cases can uncover an organization that's interested in recovering surplus food, even prepared food. If you're in the US, Food Rescue US is a real expert in capturing prepared foods. And you can also look into diversion options. I know in Washington, D.C., when I used to plan events, I would work with a composter, Veterans Compost, who would come and drop off a bin, or as many bins as we need, and do a dedicated pickup just from that event. Even if the venue or caterer does not have an existing contract with these stakeholders or these partners, you can find ways of trying it out through a pilot or something like this. And that can actually have an outsized impact beyond just your meeting event where you're piloting these innovative, food donation partnership or a food waste diversion partnership. You can model it, and then you can leave that relationship for the venue and caterer on into the future. And you can hear that, next time we're in town, we'll come back to you because we're so excited about the network of support you have here.
Well, and there was a story a couple months ago in one of the events industry magazines about a planner who had done that, because she approached the convention center and they're like, well, we don't do that because we're going to get sued. And she did her due diligence and found a partner in the community. And now that convention center and that food rescue company work hand in hand. And so I have this image in one of my presentations. It's of a plate and all of the responsibilities that meeting planners have: transportation, speakers, AV, whatever, and dietary, and adding dietary restrictions, adding food service. But this is when companies are really focused on corporate social responsibility, managing the food waste turns into one of those immediately.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a low-hanging fruit, It's something that, and there's more opportunities than just capturing, value or resources for a community or to mitigate environmental impact. It's also at a meeting and event, food is the main event. You know what I mean? Right. Everyone's looking towards their next meal, and whether there's going to be something special, and that time that you get to sit down and network with your colleagues or other guests. And I think that I was always the nerd that would read every bit of collateral on a paper, or I would read every sign on each dish, because I loved to learn more about food and what I was eating and where it came from. And I think a lot of that collateral is something that can be very valuable at a meeting or event, included in the brochure, included in the or the program. Just even a comment on, we're working with this food recovery partner. We are making sure any food waste that's produced is being diverted, but we'd like to produce as little food waste as possible, because of course, reduction of food waste is always more sustainable, has more outcomes than donating food or diverting it. But even just noting some of these community relationships, or say you're preparing sustainable foods, you've made a real effort to make sure you're not featuring any endangered or threatened species on your menus, or you're taking or you're making efforts to reuse the same item in many dishes for the purpose of reducing food waste in production. And that's something that gets exciting and interesting for folks to read about and learn about. And you can always tie it back to your mission and your goals to really drive home what you're all doing there. Because you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find a topic that never comes back to food, and you can never tie it back. Everything comes back to food. And we can always speak about our values through our food and through our food service.
Right, exactly. And I think, whether it's a corporate meeting or an association meeting or whatever, but getting the attendees involved in as well, educating them on, who's getting the food. And I think it always is exciting when, with those build a bike programs, right? You bring in the kids that you're donating the bikes to, bring in somebody from that nonprofit that you're donating the food to, and share how that food is being distributed to them, because it really does add to that story and helps elevate it. But I do like bringing it up front, having that communication throughout the entire planning process and not just at the end, because it needs to be forethought. It can't just be done at the last minute.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would say if you're listening into this podcast, this episode, and you are seeing opportunities in your own role to have some of these conversations or to try something new, I'd encourage you to do so. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to hit every single aspect of sustainable food to have a really outsized impact, and also to share something really compelling with your guests and your clients about their values and what you can do in a meeting and event to share that. Because if you bring in your food donation partner, you have them speak for 5 minutes about the impact that the donated food will have.
Mm-hmm.
You have no idea which one of your guests might be planning an event next week or lives locally and is interested to support this organization later. And you might be in uncharted territory the first time you do this and the first time you have conversations with stakeholders and you try some of these things. But after that first time, you're going to have a much increased understanding of how these things can work. And also the next meeting or event planner that comes down the road will have a much easier conversation to have with that venue or caterer to really talk about what's happened before. And now it won't be their first time around the block, And if you can support that with your passion or your interest, or if you have a client that shares that mission, then I think it's your invitation to do something really cool. And I'll also say the sector and the industry, I know myself, and I can maybe speak for Tracy as well, is interested to hear about those pieces and amplify them, because we need these positive examples, because we're all finding the way forward together.
Well, and something that, and 100% agree, because we are finding our way something that you said to me when I asked you before the show, what you wish people knew what you do. And then I'm going to come back to something else that I thought of is, we want to change the standard ways of doing business and formalize previous less formal aspects of event planning, like forecasting, to right-size food production and better serve guests. And it's changing, just checking the boxes, right? And it's changing, really rethinking. And I have to say, there's some event planners that this is not on their radar, right? Their logistics, they manage that, but this is an overarching strategic thought process as well. And for the last 15 years, we've talked about meeting planners trying to get a seat at that table. And looking at this and what we do as event planning, promoting that and saying, hey, what we do here by reducing food waste, we're supporting our sustainability practices, if your company has them. We're supporting local communities, if that's what your company is, committed to. So it's actually elevating you and your role, that's helping the company meet the targets that it wants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, meetings and events are often, when we're speaking of corporate clients, these are often the moments that this is the moment that the company gets to speak their values, and it's like suddenly it comes into the real space. You're physically embedded in the company and their messages, what they're trying to convey in these cases. And I think even if it's your internal staff, I know many corporate clients are often bringing together, especially in our new remote work world, we're coming together really to spend time in the culture and the environment of this organization. And you have so many opportunities along the way to share your identity. And food is one of the best ways to do it. And often it is. The meals are often these times where you can speak to your values or have presentations that are more fun, or these moments. So absolutely take that opportunity to really create a space that breathes the values you're trying to put out in the world, because it's really a critical opportunity, because you have this captive audience that's just embedded and really submerged in the experience of what you've crafted there. And a meeting or event planner has a critical role in coordination of these events functions. It's not something your client can bring to the table, and often it's not something a venue or caterer can do on their own. And only by requesting it, even if they can't meet your requests, only by requesting it can we make the industry start shifting towards this as more of a standard operating procedure, business as usual.
Well, and the one thing that came to my mind when you were talking a few minutes ago is that we're supporting our communities, but also coming out of the pandemic, right? How many of your employees actually had to go visit a food bank for the first time, right? You don't necessarily know that. and you don't know somebody who actually goes to the food bank on a daily basis, even not including the pandemic, right? Yeah. So, and it's going to those pantries and utilizing that. And so you're actually, by doing this, you're also potentially supporting your employees themselves and showing how you're giving back. And they may not tell you that they're one of those recipients, but by putting that forward, you're showing how the company that they work for. And that's what I think a lot more millennials as well. And even I think older adults are looking to, how do we support our local communities? But when you're doing that, you're also probably really supporting your own employees and their families as well. Because somebody knows somebody, we all know somebody that's probably visited the food bank, especially in the last 3 years.
Absolutely. COVID and the pandemic put many families in lines at a food bank that hadn't expected to be there previously. And I would say so many individuals and families will benefit from food assistance at some point in their lives, especially in a moment like the pandemic where supply chains are broken down. And even if a family wasn't experiencing food insecurity, they almost definitely experienced a food shortage or a shift in the way they were feeding themselves during the pandemic. And I feel it's quite critical. And also in the meetings and event space, we're working with the culinary sector, and even business as usual, many employees of the culinary sector are paid a wage that is below the amount where they could live in food security, even just on a normal business as usual daily basis. So at a meeting and event, there's already this immediate circular loop of, if we're able to capture this food, it could at least not go to waste, complete waste of resource and value. At least it can support these community programs, which are often, in many cases, these community programs are sourcing more often like canned foods and shelf-stable foods. And sometimes these prepared foods can be a really fantastic addition to their operation and something quite critical. So I also feel it's more and more important to have these discussions out loud and transparently. I think that in many cases, individuals and companies are interested in doing well on paper and doing what they can do to support communities in the environment. They don't always want to bring that to their guests or their employees. Because they think maybe it's a level of nuance that's not interesting, or they see, but in fact, there's quite a huge opportunity, even in just receiving the good faith from your employees and your guests. And when you share what you're doing, you are multiplying the impact of it, because each individual feels, wow, I'm in a room of folks that are supporting this aspect of our community, that are participating or maybe benefiting from this aspect of our community or this food support organization. And maybe I have a role to play here too, even if it's maybe not taking extra food off the buffet. That's not going to change the world in this case. But if all of us begin tuning in a little bit more to the value of food and what that food could do if it's not in our trash bins, then we all become a little bit more aware of how all of our communities need to function with this critical resource.
Right. And I no idea why this image just came to my mind. Well, actually, I think it was because you said, looking in the trash. I mean, I can probably say, it's looked down upon for people who are foraging through trash cans to find the food. So why not keep it out of that and give it to them in an environment that is safe and clean, and that where they're potentially looking for food at a food bank or, an overnight facility, a housing facility, that they can feed them. Right. So it's
absolutely.
And I don't mean that in any kind of bad way, but we need to turn it around and use this as an opportunity to give back.
Absolutely, that opportunity is there. And when you have an ecosystem of food recovery that has access to prepared food and canned food and all of the same options that many of us get when we go to a grocery store, food banks are actually, in many cases, these modern food banks are using almost a marketplace style where folks come in and they get a shopping cart and they pick the foods that they'd like to cook and eat. They're not just handed food. And that's a dignity and a human respect that everyone is fully entitled to. And I'll also say that food recovery and surplus food from meetings and events, it's quite critical for environmental and social outcomes for us to reduce the amount of food we're wasting really at each level. When we are a farmer, we should be thinking about reducing our food loss. When we are someone moving food from place to place, we should be thinking about it as a chef, as a guest, as a client, as a meeting planner. But we also have to think holistically about food. So food waste isn't the only issue in our food system by any means. And hunger can't be solved simply by recovering food. And we need a system that is producing food and providing food such that everyone can benefit from it. And right now we're in a condition where that's not the case globally and also in the United States. So we have to find these Band-Aid options as we're figuring out how to really right size our food production. Let's make sure we're not throwing food in the bin. And if it's high quality, let's make sure it's feeding people whenever possible. But let's also stay tuned into what a sustainable food system can really look like. And how can we support our communities such that in 10 years, we won't be producing that surplus food, but it also isn't needed by our community organizations because there's systems within our communities and our economies that every member of our society can have access to healthy, nutritious food and also food they enjoy in a way that's dignified and, open to each individual as an equal, of course.
Okay, so getting pushback from properties, from hotels and venues, I've experienced it personally, and I know we talked about, come to the table with your own, your own partner that can do that. But can you share some best practices that you've seen meeting planners do and or hotels do to convince meeting planners that we're doing this? To say, hey, this is the way to go about doing this. But let's start with the planner. How can the planner, some 2 or 3 best practices the planners can bring to the venues besides having their own donation partner in mind?
Sure. So I think a big piece is taking a look at who you're already working with, because there's a good chance that if you're someone with these values, you've already exposed yourself to others in the sector that have similar values and share a similar mission or would like to do things a little bit differently. So even if you're not seeing these existing structures, but you are working within a market or a sector and there might be opportunity to grow with your peers already and shift all of you guys towards improved operations. And that's also a differentiator for you as a meeting planner, for them as a venue. It's really a win-win-win situation. You can also think seeking new vendors and new partners through competitive RFP processes, which I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with clients of a certain size. And you can include food sustainability as a call out in your RFP processes and say, in your proposal, please include how you might already facilitate food donation or food waste diversion or reduction of food waste through production. And if not, would you be willing and open to adjusting our contract such that these items are included? I would definitely recommend including some of these line items in a contract as possible. You could use, not such legally binding language or whatever feels quite necessary. But I think those moments, or even a banquet event order or these more formal documentations, where you can actually note your preference and priority so they can meet that requirement as best as they can, or you can review it and find other ways into the future. You can also ask your venue or your caterer to provide you a report after the fact on food waste or food sustainability or something like this. That's, of course, easier if they're measuring food waste. And I would say that you're going to find more and more venues and caterers that have food waste reduction and food waste management built into their offerings. And it's really critical just to ask the question, because they might already be hitting all your boxes and you're just not able to share that with your client or your guests because the question wasn't asked.
Right. And that's the important thing, is ask the questions. No question is stupid, right? Yeah. And especially if you're trying to reach those goals. There was something in there that you said. It escaped my brain what I was going to ask you from that. Just asking the questions, what do you do? What is the process for doing that? And getting them, I know what it was, getting them to actually put it into the contract or putting it into their answers of the RFP is really, really important. Say, here, I want to know what my heads and beds are, my room rate is, the resort fee, but I do need you to complete these questions, right? And answer those to even be considered. Right. And now, I'm going to jump back to the question, because you said BEO, and a lot of people forget that the BEO is another contract. And I think, and the front of the house staff uses that as a Bible as they're, bringing out food, serving it and such and such. And, the food that's on my plate that I didn't eat will definitely 100% go into a trash can. But I think spelling it out on the BEO, just saying, do not replace the chafing dishes until there's nothing left in it, is really important to put on there.
Yeah. It is critical. And I'll say it's critical because you might think as an individual, these things aren't always intuitive. So you might think as an individual, no server would ever, take a chafer dish off a buffet and throw all of the remaining food out and then put another tray of that same
I
food.
watched that happen 2 weeks ago.
Absolutely. Well, it's also a best practice in many cases, and some will do it for the sake of food safety and food security.
Right.
And I think these things are really critical because it's not an individual's, moral choice this way or that way when they're throwing out food. It's someone trying to do their job to the best of their ability. And also there's individuals that are guests that don't want to take, the very last egg roll out of the chafer because they think it's cold or someone else has passed it over or something like that. And I think it can be quite critical not only to share with your servers that you have a preference to have the chafers empty or almost empty, and then require a backfill because the item would not have been out for more than 4 hours. So it is totally food safe. And to require a backfill where you take out the first chafer, you put in the next chafer, and then you backfill all of the items right on top. So it's the first taken. And
that's not pretty, Samantha.
Well, you have to no, it's a best practice. And there's ways to do it that might seem a little less scary than others. And also it might work for those egg rolls and it might not work for a gorgeous composed salad of these types. And you have to almost be ready for that nuance and say, where possible, let's do this. If we're looking at a composed salad that you don't want to flop something on top, let's bring out a smaller dish next. And we could keep it this way and this way. So there's many different ways. And often the best people to think about those buffet mechanics are the folks serving the buffet. So it's really more about sharing the value, and then they can come back and get their gears turning a little bit. They have an invitation now to maybe do things a little bit differently, and they can really think about those dynamics that can make the most of the food on the buffet. But I'll also say, it's also why it's quite critical to share with your guests that you're working to reduce food waste. Because if you say to them, our servers are going to be leaving out the dishes until they're mostly empty, feel confident that the item you're taking is high quality, the servers are watching to make sure they're removing anything that blah, 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 then your guests will just dismiss, in many cases will dismiss that it's even subconscious, that subconscious piece that says, pass that over because it might be old. They're thinking, oh, you know what, that's perfect. And I was told just now that it was perfect and I get to take it because they're just working to reduce food waste here. So it's important to trust everyone, to understand the priority around food sustainability, and then to live those.
Well, and for some reason, I'm like, why don't you do the happy dance? Hey, I got the last spring roll. Ha, ha, ha. Do something fun with that, right? Nobody's ever going to do that probably, but maybe somebody will. But it is, and I like the fact that you said to bring in the servers because they are the front of the house. They are the ones that are interacting with your guests. They are the ones that understand how it looks and how it manages when you're trying to replace, chafing dishes with long lines and things like that. But they're imperative to your service. And they need to be able to having ownership to that, I think elevates their job and in their mind. And I was actually at an event, I think it was last month. Some of those servers have worked there for 36 years.
Wow.
So they know that property in and out. They know how they do things and what works best in specific rooms and things like that. Get their input.
Yeah. I mean, there is a pre-shift meeting before every one of your meetings and events. And there's a standard way of doing things, but folks are really ready for the nuance. There's special requests all the time. And you can be sure that those servers are standing with their manager right before your meeting, and they're discussing how the food service will be going. And there is a moment right then where they can have a note in their hand that says, from our meeting planner, they're requesting we backfill the chafer dishes or something like this. And you absolutely, up until the last minute, have a moment to capture some of that food or to adjust that standard, I would also say sit back and observe. So for this event, it might make a lot of sense to share these priorities. It might be the very first time this team is thinking about these priorities in the way that you've agreed on them. Sit back and take a look. There might be an opportunity during a meeting, an event, to close in on food waste even more, to reduce even more, capture it. But more than that, it's quite critical to then have you're able to reflect afterwards on your observations and share that back with your caterers and venues and clients and say, we have a shared priority to address food waste. We worked on it and we had great success in these ways. I did notice that this happened, and maybe there wasn't the backfill, even though we'd shared that preference. We understand that that's a standard and we understand it takes time to change behaviors. Next time, let's really focus in on getting that part right, because it's not something we don't have a full time to all be, laser focused on food service for our entire meeting and event. There's many priorities and responsibilities we have to cover. But as you're observing, it's never something, I told them to backfill. Why didn't they do it this time? These are some new behaviors, but we can hold really positive conversations with our stakeholders that can harbor or foster relationships into the future that have really positive benefits for reducing food waste or saving food from our meetings and events.
Well, and just thinking about that, and we're going to wrap it up in a minute, the thinking about doing your observations, not just looking at the servers, but looking at what food is left on the table. Definitely. And our friend Aurora has a great story that she shares from the New Orleans Convention Center. It's like, the chef realized that no bagels weren't being eaten, right? And so he shared with the meeting planners, don't order the bagels. Nobody's eating the bagels because they're too cumbersome. There's 2 pieces. You have to toast them. He's like, people are coming to New Orleans for beignets or, so converting that, paying attention to, or asking your food service team, was the banana bread eaten? What was the consumption of muffins or things like that? Because why order it next time if your people don't like to eat it?
Definitely. And no one loves to walk past an item they don't want to eat. It doesn't give a sense of abundance or anything like that. And, in many cases these days, we're seeing large meetings and event venues using things like a lean path or a winnow system or
no, what are those?
Nitro. These are systems, they're smart scales. They're scales that go in a kitchen. And you can actually measure food waste as you're producing ingredients in meals, as you're prepping ingredients in meals, but you can also measure food waste from plates or from buffets. Okay. And these systems can actually give you numbers on what was overproduced, what went to waste on a plate. If something is wasted off a buffet, it could be because people weren't interested to take it because it didn't maybe look beautiful or whatever reason. Right. But if something's wasted on a plate, that might mean that it didn't taste good, but it looked good enough to be taken. So there's many observations you can take and strategies you can extract from data, from collected data. And I would have a conversation with your venues and your caterers to see if they can capture information like that. Many are doing it already, but wouldn't think to share it back unless it was requested. Those things, it just ends up better and better service for your guests and more delicious food service. You'll be the talk of the town. I want to head back to every conference that they'll hold.
Well, you've given us a lot of really good food for thought, pun intended, and thinking about how we address different things. And it is, the more we ask, the more we can actually facilitate change. And, if you're going to XYZ Hotel and then I'm going to XYZ Hotel and you and I are both asking the same kinds of questions. Hey, what are you doing for food recovery? How do you manage your food waste? Maybe that's going to spark, I'm hoping it's sparking somebody in the sales manager's brain, because to me, the sales manager is imperative in this. They need to go and sit in the kitchen and watch it and participate in this and or serve plates and understand how the bank, because to me, a salesperson for a hotel or convention center has a huge opportunity to make more money for themselves and for their everybody that's behind them, right? By addressing some of these questions that understanding how to answer these questions that meeting planners are coming to them with.
I completely agree. It's all about that open line of communication and finding new ways to do things. And I'm finding more and more folks are ready for that conversation.
Yeah. I think so. And it's just, hey, if you're the only one in your sales team doing it, go ahead and keep doing it. because maybe you'll teach the other team members on your staff that. So thank you. All right. My final question is, actually I have two questions for you because it's the day before Thanksgiving. What does safe, sustainable, and inclusive, what does that mean to you as it relates to a food and beverage event?
Yeah. Safe, sustainable, and inclusive. I think these are quite critical words to have on your mind as you're planning food service. Number one, I think it's quite critical that safety is top of the list. And I know if you're tuning into Tracy's program, you're already thinking about this, but everyone should feel safe dining with you and unafraid of getting sick or having an unlisted allergy triggered. So this is absolutely critical. And sustainability and inclusivity, these are missions and underpinning directional values that we should be using when we're thinking about food. And I would say we should more and more knit together topics of sustainability and inclusivity, because we are only seeing sustainable systems where everyone has a place at the table. We don't have a path towards sustainable systems that leaves people behind. So as you're going through your menus, think about how to bring your guests and the stakeholders planning this event and driving this event forward. Think about how to bring them into this conversation and always tie it back. Who is hosting us here? Whose land are we on now? And how can we find ways of building this community to better and better represent the people that we serve? So always keeping that top of mind. And I think a safe and sustainable and inclusive meal at an event is one that I'm enjoying around the table with close and trusted colleagues always. And that's a safe space that we all are familiar with, is a table of friendly faces.
Oh, I love that. Yep. Because it's always that conversation that you have. You make new friends, you rekindle old ones, etc. Okay. So since we're on the day before Thanksgiving, what are you looking forward to eating tomorrow?
Stuffing. And
Stuffing. Oh, that's not my favorite at all.
No, not your favorite.
No.
That's always been my favorite. And I will say, as a food waste expert, my favorite Thanksgiving meal is what I eat the day after, and it is the sandwich with everything included.
Yep. The roll that was on the table, stuffed with turkey and mashed potatoes and stuffing. That's what my sister-in-law eats on Friday. Yes.
You've got it. You've got it. What about you?
Cherry pie. And I've made it since I was, umpteen years old, and I make my crust fresh and, use the Oregon cherries. And so I clean that. If nobody's eaten it, I eat it for breakfast, I eat it for lunch, and I eat it for dinner the next day.
You're making me hungry.
Yes. Yeah. Likewise. So, well, Samantha, I so appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much.
Same to you, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me. Safe travels, and I wish you exactly the right amount of leftovers.
Very, very true. So until then, stay safe and eat well. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.